Margaret Adams walked into the towering lobby of the Adams Grand Hotel with an air of quiet dignity. Her simple dress and weathered handbag contrasted sharply with the marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and well-dressed patrons bustling around. She adjusted her hat, her steel-gray eyes observing every detail. To everyone else, she was just an ordinary old woman wandering into a world far above her station. At the reception desk, a young clerk glanced up briefly before returning his attention to his phone. Margaret cleared her throat politely. "Excuse me," she said. He sighed, setting his phone down with exaggerated reluctance. "Can I help you, ma'am?" His tone carried a thinly veiled irritation. "I'd like to speak with the general manager," Margaret replied. The clerk smirked. "Do you have an appointment?" Margaret shook her head. "No, but then I'm afraid that's not possible." He cut her off, his smile widening as though he enjoyed the rejection. "Mr. Cole is a very busy man." Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a loud voice cut through the air. "What's this, Harold?" It was Sylvia, the head of guest relations, her sharp heels clicking against the marble floor as she approached. "Is there a problem here?" Harold motioned toward Margaret. "This lady is asking for the general manager without an appointment." Sylvia's eyes swept over Margaret, lingering on her scuffed shoes and threadbare coat. Her smile was tight and perfunctory. "Ma'am, perhaps you're looking for the service entrance. It's around the back." Margaret's jaw tightened. "I'm not looking for the service entrance," she said calmly. "I'd like to speak to Mr. Cole." "Of course," Sylvia said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "But as I'm sure you understand, our general manager doesn't meet with just anyone." Margaret nodded slowly. "I see. And is that your final word on the matter?" Sylvia exchanged a look with Harold, suppressing a laugh. "It is." A silence fell over the lobby as Margaret reached into her handbag, pulling out a sleek black card embossed with gold lettering. She handed it to Sylvia, whose confident smile faltered as she read the name. "Margaret Adams," Margaret said softly, watching Sylvia's face pale. "Owner of the Adams Grand Hotel?" Sylvia stammered, her composure crumbling. "I am so sorry, Ms. Adams. I didn't recognize you." Margaret held up a hand to silence her. The lobby was now eerily quiet, all eyes fixed on the woman who had just shattered their assumptions. "I believe you said Mr. Cole is busy?" Margaret asked, her voice steady and cool. "Perhaps he'll make time when I inform him of this interaction." Sylvia flushed crimson, her professional mask slipping entirely. "Of course, Ms. Adams. I'll call him right away." Margaret smiled faintly, but her eyes betrayed no humor. "Please do." As Sylvia scurried off, Margaret turned to Harold, who now looked as though he wished he could vanish into the floor. "And you," she said, her voice soft but cutting. "Perhaps you should spend less time on your phone and more time on your manners?" Harold nodded rapidly, muttering an apology. Margaret stepped back, surveying the scene. Guests whispered among themselves, the weight of her identity sinking in. But Margaret didn't bask in the attention. She simply adjusted her handbag, her expression unreadable. Moments later, Sylvia returned, her demeanor now entirely deferential. "Mr. Cole will see you immediately, Ms. Adams. Please follow me." Margaret inclined her head and followed Sylvia toward the executive office suite. As she walked, she caught the murmurs around her, words like unbelievable and never would have guessed. She let them wash over her, her mind already moving to the challenges ahead. By the time she entered the office, the shock of the lobby had faded, replaced by a steely resolve. This was her hotel, her legacy. And she would not let it crumble under anyone's arrogance. Not her staff's, not her competitors', and certainly not her own. Margaret Adams sat in the plush leather chair in the general manager's office, her gaze fixed out the window at the sprawling city skyline. Despite the opulence surrounding her, her thoughts traveled back in time, to a different city, a different life, and a younger version of herself. 40 years earlier, Margaret was Margaret Harper, a waitress in a dingy diner on the outskirts of Pittsburgh. The diner was a refuge for truckers, night owls, and dreamers, but for Margaret, it was a prison. Each shift was an endless loop of greasy plates, leering customers, and a boss who paid just enough to keep her coming back. Margaret had always dreamed of something bigger. She had a knack for organization, a head for numbers, and an instinct for finding potential where others saw nothing. But in those days, dreams were luxuries she couldn't afford. Every dollar she earned went toward rent, groceries, and her young son, Jacob. Jacob was her world, bright-eyed, curious, and always asking questions she didn't know how to answer. His father had walked out before he was born, leaving Margaret to carry the weight of their small family on her own. She'd promised herself that Jacob would have a better life, even if it meant sacrificing her own dreams. But life had other plans. One fateful winter, Jacob fell gravely ill. Medical bills piled up faster than Margaret could pay them, and the landlord's threats grew more menacing with each passing week. Desperate and out of options, Margaret made the hardest decision of her life. She placed Jacob in the care of a social service agency, hoping they could provide what she couldn't. The memory of watching him walk away with a caseworker still haunted her. He had turned to look at her, his small hand clutching a worn teddy bear. "I'll come back for you," she'd whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I promise." She never saw him again. Margaret blinked, pulling herself back to the present. Those years of struggle had forged her into the woman she was today, resilient, resourceful, and unyielding. After losing Jacob, she had thrown herself into her work, taking on odd jobs wherever she could find them. She learned bookkeeping from a kind-hearted accountant who frequented the diner. She saved every penny she could spare, pouring her pain into a singular goal, building something of her own. Her break came when she met Arthur Adams, an older businessman who saw potential in her that no one else had. Arthur owned a string of motels across the Midwest, and he hired Margaret as his assistant. She proved invaluable, streamlining operations and increasing profits in ways Arthur hadn't thought possible. It wasn't long before their relationship deepened. Arthur admired her drive and tenacity, and Margaret respected his vision and integrity. They married quietly, blending their lives and ambitions. When Arthur passed away 10 years later, Margaret inherited his business empire. Most assumed she'd sell the motels and retire comfortably. Instead, she expanded them, transforming a modest chain into a respected name in hospitality. Her crowning achievement was the Adams Grand Hotel, a gleaming symbol of everything she'd overcome and everything she still hoped to achieve. But even as she built her empire, Margaret never stopped searching for Jacob. Private investigators, online databases, even whispered prayers, she tried it all. Decades had passed and the trail had gone cold, but the promise she'd made to her son burned as fiercely as ever. The door to the office opened and Margaret turned to see Greg Cole, the hotel's general manager, enter with a forced smile. His tailored suit and carefully styled hair spoke of ambition, but Margaret knew his type too well, polished on the outside but ruthless beneath. "Miss Adams," he began, extending a hand. "What a pleasure to see you." Margaret didn't rise. "Mr. Cole," she said evenly. "Sit." His smile faltered, but he obeyed, lowering himself into the chair across from her. "I wasn't expecting you today. Is there something I can help you with?" Margaret folded her hands in her lap. "I've received reports about issues with staff morale, declining profits, and lapses in service standards. Would you care to explain?" Cole's smile returned, though it didn't reach his eyes. "We've faced some challenges, certainly. The market is competitive and—" Margaret held up a hand. "Spare me the excuses, Mr. Cole. I didn't build this hotel to hear excuses. I built it to set a standard, and that standard is slipping." Cole bristled, his confidence wavering. "With all due respect, Ms. Adams, you haven't been directly involved in the day-to-day operations. Perhaps you're not fully aware of the complexities we're facing." Margaret leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "I'm aware of more than you think, Mr. Cole. And I'll be even more aware now that I'm taking a more active role in this hotel. Effective immediately." Cole's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Of course. Whatever you think is best." Margaret stood, her presence commanding. "This hotel bears my name, Mr. Cole. I won't let it fall into ruin. If you can't uphold its standards, I'll find someone who can." She walked to the door, pausing to look back at him. "And one more thing, treat every person who walks through these doors with respect. That includes me, no matter how I'm dressed." Without waiting for a response, Margaret left the office, her heels clicking against the marble floors. She had built this hotel from nothing and she wasn't about to let it crumble. As she stepped into the elevator, Margaret allowed herself a small, determined smile. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she had faced worse. And if she had to fight for her legacy, her hotel, and her son, she would. Margaret stood in the heart of the Adams Grand Hotel, watching as the staff bustled about. It was a scene she had orchestrated countless times in her mind, orderly, efficient, polished. Yet, as she observed the interactions and subtle dynamics, a sinking feeling grew in her chest. The cracks she had sensed in her empire weren't surface level, they ran deep. The next morning, Margaret summoned Greg Cole and the department heads to the executive boardroom. The room's massive oak table gleamed under the bright overhead lights, its sheen reflecting the tense faces of those seated around it. Margaret entered last, her presence immediately silencing the low murmurs. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice measured but firm. "I won't waste your time with pleasantries. I'm here because this hotel is not living up to its reputation. The Adams Grand Hotel is supposed to be a symbol of excellence, but what I see is mediocrity. That changes today." Cole cleared his throat. "Ms. Adams, with all due respect, we've been managing as best as we can. The industry is evolving and—" Margaret cut him off with a sharp look. "And you failed to evolve with it. I've reviewed the numbers. Occupancy rates are down. Guest satisfaction scores are declining. And the profit margins? Let's just say I've seen better figures in the early days of running roadside motels." Several department heads shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging wary glances. "I've also received troubling reports about staff treatment," Margaret continued. Her gaze swept across the room, lingering on each face. "This hotel is more than just a business. It's a community. If the staff aren't respected, how can they be expected to respect the guests?" Cole's face tightened. "If there are specific complaints, I'll be happy to address them." "There are," Margaret said, sliding a file across the table toward him. "And I expect a detailed response by the end of the week." Cole's jaw clenched, but he nodded, taking the file with a forced smile. "Of course." Margaret turned her attention to the other department heads. "I want proposals from each of you on how to improve your areas. You have 3 days. This isn't just about saving face, it's about preserving what this hotel represents. Excellence, dignity, and humanity." The room fell silent as her words hung in the air. One by one, the department heads nodded. Margaret dismissed them, but as they filed out, she noticed a few reluctant glances cast toward Cole. It was a subtle gesture, but it spoke volumes. Later that afternoon, Margaret made her way to the employee break room. It was modest compared to the grandeur of the guest spaces, but it was clean and functional. A few staff members paused mid-conversation as she entered, their eyes widening in surprise. "Don't mind me," she said with a gentle smile, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "I'm just here to observe." She sat at one of the small tables, sipping her coffee and listening as the employees gradually resumed their chatter. It didn't take long for the truth to surface. Complaints about overbearing supervisors, unrealistic workloads, and a lack of appreciation were woven into their conversations. Margaret noted every word, her resolve hardening. When one young housekeeper tentatively approached her, Margaret smiled encouragingly. "What's your name?" "Annie, ma'am," the woman replied, twisting her hands nervously. "I didn't mean to disturb you." "Not at all," Margaret said warmly. "Tell me, Annie, what's the most challenging part of your job?" Annie hesitated, glancing around the room before leaning closer. "Honestly, it's the way some of the managers treat us. They act like we're disposable. Like we don't matter." Margaret's chest tightened. "That's not acceptable," she said firmly. "You matter, Annie. Every person in this hotel matters." Annie's eyes widened and she nodded quickly. "Thank you, ma'am." Margaret watched as the young woman returned to her colleagues, her words resonating with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. This was the heart of the problem, Margaret realized. The hotel wasn't just battling external challenges, it was rotting from within. That evening, Margaret reviewed the hotel's financial and operational reports in her suite. Stacks of papers and spreadsheets covered the desk, each one a testament to the mismanagement she'd allowed to fester in her absence. She was halfway through a particularly troubling budget analysis when there was a knock at the door. "Come in," she called. The door opened to reveal Claire, her adoptive daughter. Claire's expression was guarded, her arms crossed over her chest. "You wanted to see me?" Margaret gestured for her to sit. "Yes. I wanted to talk about your department." Claire sighed, dropping into the chair across from her. "Let me guess. It's not good enough." Margaret frowned. "That's not fair, Claire. I'm trying to understand where things went wrong." "Where things went wrong?" Claire laughed bitterly. "Maybe it's because you left everything to Cole and the rest of your trusted team while you played the absentee owner." Margaret stiffened at the accusation. "I trusted the people I hired to maintain the standards I set. Clearly that trust was misplaced. And now you're swooping in to fix everything," Claire said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "How convenient." Margaret's heart ached at the hostility in Claire's tone. "Claire, I know you felt overlooked. I know I haven't always been the mother you needed. But this isn't about my mistakes. It's about saving this hotel, for everyone." Claire stood abruptly. "Save it for someone who cares," she snapped, storming out of the room. Margaret stared after her, the sting of her words cutting deep. She had always tried to give Claire the love and stability she never had as a child, but it seemed her efforts had fallen short. Now, the cracks in their relationship felt as irreparable as the ones threatening the hotel's foundation. As the door clicked shut, Margaret turned back to her desk. The challenges ahead were daunting, but she wouldn't let them defeat her. Not the hotel, not the staff, and not her family. Margaret stared at the small, weathered photo on her desk. It was of Jacob as a child, clutching his favorite teddy bear, his wide smile framed by the soft light of a summer afternoon. Decades had passed, but the memory remained vivid. Jacob's laughter, his questions, and that heartbreaking day when she had to let him go. Now, after years of dead ends and unanswered prayers, a flicker of hope had reignited. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Margaret looked up to see Victor, a private investigator she had hired on and off over the years. His arrival was unexpected, but the somber expression on his face made her heart race with both anticipation and dread. "Ms. Adams," Victor began, setting his worn leather briefcase on the desk. "I may have found something." Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she gestured for him to sit. "Go on." Victor opened the briefcase, pulling out a folder filled with documents and photographs. A man fitting Jacob's description, age, location, even a few shared details from the limited records we could access, turned up in Michigan. Margaret's breath caught. "Michigan?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's not far." Victor nodded. "He works as a contractor. His name is Andrew Harper. He uses your maiden name, which is promising. But before you get your hopes up too much, I need to warn you. He's had a difficult life." Margaret reached for the photo Victor slid toward her. It was a candid shot of a man in his 40s, wearing work boots and a flannel shirt. He had a strong, rugged face, but his eyes held a weariness that spoke of hardship. Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes as she clutched the photo. "Does he know about me?" Victor hesitated. "Not yet. I wanted to confirm with you before reaching out." Margaret nodded, her emotions a storm inside her chest. "I need to see him, Victor. I need to know if it's him." Victor leaned forward, his voice gentle. "I'll arrange a meeting. But Margaret, you need to prepare yourself. He may not be ready to hear your story." Margaret swallowed hard. "I've waited decades, Victor. I'll wait as long as it takes." Later that evening, Margaret sat in her suite, the photo of Andrew resting on the table beside her. Her mind raced with questions. Was this really her Jacob? If so, what would she say to him? How could she begin to bridge the years of separation and pain? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Claire entered, her expression cautious. "You wanted to see me?" Margaret gestured to the chair opposite her. "Yes, Claire. Please sit." Claire reluctantly complied, her arms crossed. "What is it this time?" Margaret studied her adoptive daughter, her heart heavy with the tension between them. "I wanted to share something with you. Something I've kept to myself for a very long time." Claire's brow furrowed as Margaret slid the photo across the table. "This is Jacob," Margaret began softly. "My son." Claire's eyes widened, her gaze flickering between the photo and Margaret. "Your son?" she echoed. "You've never mentioned him before." "I've been searching for him for decades," Margaret admitted. "I had to give him up when he was a child. It was the hardest decision I've ever made, but I had no choice." Claire's posture stiffened. "So that's why you took me in? To fill the void?" Margaret's eyes glistened with tears. "No, Claire. I took you in because I love you. You're my daughter in every way that matters. But Jacob, he's my unfinished chapter. And I think I've finally found him." Claire stared at the photo in silence, her emotions unreadable. "What happens if you do find him?" she asked finally. "Do I just get pushed aside?" Margaret reached across the table, placing a hand over Claire's. "Never. You're my family, Claire. This isn't about replacing anyone. It's about healing. For all of us." Claire pulled her hand away, her expression guarded. "I hope you mean that," she said quietly before standing. "Good luck finding him." As Claire walked out, Margaret felt the familiar ache of a bridge unbuilt. But there was no time to dwell. She had to focus on the task at hand, finding Jacob and finally keeping the promise she had made so long ago. 2 days later, Margaret and Victor traveled to a modest suburb outside Detroit. They parked outside a small, weathered house with a pickup truck in the driveway. Margaret's heart pounded as she stepped out of the car, clutching the photo of Andrew in her hand. Victor gestured toward the house. "He's home. Are you ready?" Margaret nodded, though she wasn't sure if she could ever be truly ready for this moment. With shaky hands, she walked up the steps and knocked on the door. After a long pause, the door creaked open, revealing the man from the photo. Up close, Margaret could see the faint resemblance to the boy she had once cradled in her arms. His eyes, though wary, carried a flicker of familiarity. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice cautious. Margaret's throat tightened. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Finally, she managed to whisper, "Andrew? Jacob, it's me. It's your mother." Andrew's expression froze, his grip on the door tightening. "My mother?" he repeated, his tone laced with disbelief. "You must have the wrong person." Margaret's heart sank. "I know this is overwhelming. But I've been searching for you for so long. Please, just let me explain." Andrew hesitated, his jaw tightening. "I don't know what kind of game this is, but I don't have time for it." He started to close the door, but Margaret placed her hand on the frame. "Please, Jacob. Just give me 5 minutes. If you don't want to hear more after that, I'll leave." Andrew's eyes flickered with a mix of confusion and emotion. Finally, he sighed and stepped aside. 5 minutes? Margaret entered the house, her heart heavy with hope and fear. This was her chance to reconnect with the son she had lost, but the road to reconciliation would be anything but easy. The sun hung low over the city skyline as Margaret returned to her suite at the Adams Grand Hotel, the weight of her encounter with Andrew pressing on her shoulders. His guarded demeanor and reluctance to accept her were understandable, yet the pain of their fractured reunion gnawed at her heart. She knew reconnecting with her son would take time, but time was a luxury she wasn't sure she had. The next morning, Margaret was greeted by a flurry of reports on her desk. Among them was an anonymous tip that made her blood run cold. Evidence of financial manipulation within the hotel's accounts. Several key expenses had been inflated, and certain contracts seemed to benefit outside firms with suspicious ties to her former associates. Margaret immediately called Greg Cole into her office. He arrived moments later, his face a mask of professionalism that Margaret now saw as a thin veneer. "Sit," she commanded, motioning to the chair across from her desk. Cole complied, his smile tight. "What can I do for you, Ms. Adams?" Margaret slid the documents across the desk, her voice icy. "Explain this." Cole glanced at the papers, his brow furrowing. "These are routine expenditures. I'm not sure what the issue is." "The issue," Margaret said, her tone sharp, "is that these expenditures are anything but routine. They're deliberate manipulations designed to siphon money out of this hotel and into the pockets of outsiders." Cole's expression hardened, but he maintained his composure. "If you're accusing me of misconduct, I'd suggest you have evidence to support such a claim." Margaret leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "You've been general manager here for years, Greg. Either you're complicit in this or incompetent. Which is it?" Cole's mask slipped for a moment, revealing a flicker of anger. "I assure you, Ms. Adams, I have always acted in the best interest of this hotel." "Then prove it," Margaret countered. "Provide me with a full audit of every contract, expense and partnership under your management. And if I find even a hint of impropriety, you'll be out the door before you can collect your severance." Cole stood, his jaw clenched. "Of course. I'll have the audit ready within the week." As he left the office, Margaret felt a surge of determination. She couldn't afford to let Cole, or anyone else, compromise what she had built. But she also knew that Cole wasn't the only threat. Later that afternoon, Margaret found herself in the staff lounge again, listening to the quiet hum of conversations. Among the murmurs, she overheard snippets of discontent, whispers of favoritism, complaints about sudden schedule changes, and concerns about management's priorities. The staff's faith in the hotel's leadership had been eroded, and Margaret knew she needed to rebuild it. As she rose to address the room, the door opened and Claire walked in. Her appearance was a surprise, but Margaret's heart sank as she saw the tension etched across her adoptive daughter's face. "Claire," Margaret said, forcing a smile. "What brings you here?" Claire glanced around the room, her expression unreadable. "I need to talk to you. Privately." Margaret nodded and led Claire into an adjacent office, closing the door behind them. "What is it?" she asked, her voice gentle. Claire hesitated, her arms crossed tightly. "I've been hearing things, Mom. About how some of your former business partners are planning to make a move against you." Margaret's pulse quickened. "What kind of move?" Claire looked away, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're spreading rumors. Saying you're losing control of the hotel, that you're unfit to run it. And they've approached me." Margaret's breath caught. "Approached you? For what?" "To help them," Claire admitted, her voice cracking. "They want me to feed them information. To make sure you fail." Margaret felt as though the air had been sucked from the room. "And what did you say?" "I didn't agree," Claire said quickly, meeting her mother's gaze. "But I didn't say no either. I needed time to think. Margaret's chest tightened. Claire, why would you even consider this? Claire's eyes filled with tears. Because I feel like I don't matter to you. Ever since you found out about Jacob, Andrew, all you've cared about is him. What about me? What about everything I've done for you? Margaret stepped closer, her voice breaking. Claire, you do matter. You've always mattered. I'm sorry if I've made you feel otherwise, but I can't lose you, not to them. Claire looked down, her tears falling freely. I just want to feel like I'm part of this family. Margaret placed a hand on Claire's shoulder, her voice trembling. You are Claire, and I'll prove it to you. But I need you to trust me, and to trust yourself. Claire nodded slowly, her defenses softening. Okay, she whispered. I'll help you. That evening, Margaret sat alone in her suite, poring over documents and piecing together the puzzle of her adversary's scheme. She knew they were circling, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But she also knew she couldn't face them alone. She needed allies, both within the hotel and beyond. As the city lights twinkled outside her window, Margaret's resolve hardened. She would fight for her hotel, her family, and her legacy, no matter the cost. The next morning, Margaret called a meeting with her department heads and senior staff. The air in the conference room was tense, the undercurrent of uncertainty rippling through the group. Greg Cole sat stiffly at the far end of the table, his expression guarded but simmering with resentment. Margaret scanned the room, her gaze steady and commanding. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice firm, I'll get straight to the point. This hotel has lost its way and it's on all of us to set it right. That means changes, big ones, and they start today. She paused, letting her words sink in. First, let's address the staff. They are the backbone of this hotel, yet they've been overlooked and undervalued. Effective immediately, we're implementing a new incentive program. Pay raises, benefits, and training opportunities. We'll also establish an employee advisory board to ensure their voices are heard. Murmurs rippled through the room, some supportive, others skeptical. Margaret raised a hand to quiet them. I know this will require adjustments, but it's non-negotiable. A happy, respected staff translates to satisfied guests, which is our ultimate goal. Greg Cole cleared his throat, his tone clipped. That's all well and good, Ms. Adams, but how do you intend to fund these changes? The budget is already stretched thin. Margaret fixed him with a sharp look. By eliminating waste and holding people accountable, Mr. Cole. If we can afford inflated contracts and unexplained expenditures, we can afford to invest in our people. Cole's mouth tightened, but he said nothing further. Margaret turned her attention to the group. Now about our guests. We've fallen into complacency, relying on past reputation to carry us. That ends now. I want innovative ideas, experiences that set us apart from every other luxury hotel in this city. Think community partnerships, cultural events, sustainable initiatives. This hotel should be a reflection of the future, not the past. The room buzzed with cautious optimism as the department heads began exchanging ideas. Margaret watched them, a flicker of hope stirring within her. Change was never easy, but she could see the seeds being planted. Later that afternoon, Margaret met Claire in the hotel's garden. The space was quiet, a peaceful oasis amidst the bustle of the city. Claire sat on a bench, her arms resting on her knees as she stared at the blooming roses. Thanks for meeting me, Margaret said, taking a seat beside her. Claire shrugged. You said it was important. It is, Margaret replied. She took a deep breath, searching for the right words. I want to apologize, for everything. For making you feel like you weren't a priority. That was never my intention. Claire glanced at her, skepticism mingling with vulnerability. It's hard not to feel that way when you're always chasing something, or someone else. Margaret nodded, the truth of Claire's words stinging. You're right. I've spent so much time looking for Jacob, for answers, that I've neglected the people right in front of me. I don't want to lose you, Claire. You mean the world to me. Claire's expression softened, but she remained guarded. Then prove it. Show me that I'm more than just a backup plan. Margaret reached for Claire's hand, her voice steady. I will. But I need your help, not just with the hotel but with this family. I want us to be stronger, together. Claire hesitated, her gaze searching Margaret's face. Finally she nodded. Okay. But this is your chance to get it right, Mom. Don't waste it. Margaret squeezed her hand, gratitude and determination flooding her heart. I won't. Over the next week, the hotel began to transform. Margaret worked tirelessly alongside the staff, listening to their concerns and implementing their ideas. The atmosphere shifted. Employees who had once felt invisible now stood taller, their pride in their work rekindled. Claire threw herself into her role as marketing director, brainstorming campaigns that highlighted the hotel's new initiatives. One idea stood out: a series of community events hosted at the hotel, ranging from art exhibitions to charity galas. Margaret approved it immediately, recognizing the potential to rebuild the hotel's reputation from the ground up. Even Greg Cole, despite his resistance, began to fall in line. Whether out of genuine agreement or fear of losing his position, he started cooperating with the new measures. Margaret kept a close eye on him, knowing trust would take time to rebuild. The first community event, a fundraiser for a local youth arts program, was held on a crisp Friday evening. The grand ballroom shimmered with elegance, the chandeliers casting warm light over the crowd. Guests mingled, admiring the artwork displayed by young artists from the community. Margaret moved through the room, her presence a steadying force. At one point, she spotted Claire chatting animatedly with a group of donors, her confidence radiating. Margaret's heart swelled with pride. This was the Claire she had always believed in, stepping into her own. Toward the end of the evening, Margaret took the stage to deliver a speech. She looked out at the crowd, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. "This hotel has always been a symbol of dreams, mine and now yours," she began. "Tonight we celebrate not just a building but a community. Together we're creating something that will last for generations, built on respect, inclusion and innovation." The applause was thunderous, but Margaret's focus was on Claire, who stood near the stage, tears shining in her eyes. For the first time in a long time, Margaret felt hope, not just for the hotel but for her family. As the event wound down, Margaret stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The night was quiet, the city lights twinkling in the distance. Claire joined her, a soft smile on her face. "You were amazing in there," Claire said. Margaret chuckled. "So were you. I couldn't have done this without you." Claire looked down, her smile tinged with emotion. "I'm proud of you, Mom. I really am." Margaret reached for Claire's hand, squeezing it gently. "And I'm proud of you, Claire. We're in this together." For the first time in years, Margaret felt a sense of peace. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for now she was exactly where she needed to be. Margaret sat in her suite at the Adams Grand Hotel, staring at the faint outlines of the city skyline through the rain-streaked window. In her hand was a letter, a relic of the past she had carried for decades. It was Jacob's first drawing, a crude but heartfelt depiction of him and his mother holding hands. She traced the lines with her finger, her mind swirling with the memory of their brief time together. A soft knock at the door broke her reverie. Margaret opened it to find Victor standing there, his expression cautious yet hopeful. "He's agreed to meet with you," Victor said, handing her a slip of paper with an address scrawled across it. "But he's hesitant. Be prepared for resistance." Margaret nodded, tucking the note into her purse. "Thank you, Victor. I'll take it from here." The meeting place was a small cafe in the heart of the city. Margaret arrived early, her heart pounding as she took a seat by the window. She ordered tea, but her hands trembled too much to drink it. Every minute felt like an eternity until the door opened, and Andrew Harper stepped inside. He scanned the room until his eyes landed on her. For a moment he froze, as if unsure whether to proceed. Margaret's breath caught as she saw the faint resemblance to the boy she had once known, the same sharp eyes, the same determined set of his jaw. Slowly Andrew approached and sat across from her. His presence was solid, grounding, but his expression was guarded, a wall she didn't know how to breach. "Thank you for coming," Margaret began, her voice softer than she intended. Andrew didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied her as if searching for answers in her face. Finally he said, "Victor told me who you are. Or who you think you are." Margaret swallowed hard. "I am your mother, Jacob. I've spent my whole life searching for you." Andrew's gaze didn't waver. "My name is Andrew," he said firmly. "Jacob doesn't exist anymore. He disappeared when his mother gave him away." The words hit Margaret like a blow, but she refused to flinch. "I never wanted to give you up," she said, her voice trembling. "I was young, desperate, and alone. I thought I was doing what was best for you." Andrew's jaw tightened. "And what about after? Did you think it was best for me to grow up in foster care? To bounce from one family to the next, wondering why I wasn't good enough for the one person who was supposed to love me?" Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. "I never stopped loving you, Jacob. Every decision I made was to try to build a life where I could find you and bring you back." Andrew leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Well, here I am. What do you want from me?" Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out the drawing, sliding it across the table. "I want to know you. I want to make amends for the time we lost." And I want you to know how much I've missed you." Andrew stared at the drawing for a long moment before pushing it back toward her. "You can't fix this with memories, Margaret. You can't undo what happened." Margaret's heart broke at the use of her first name, the distance it created between them. "I know I can't change the past," she said, "but I can try to be part of your present. If you'll let me." Andrew's expression softened, but only slightly. "I don't know if I can trust you. I don't even know if I want to." The pain in his voice was raw, unfiltered. Margaret nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "Take all the time you need," she said quietly. "I'm not going anywhere." Andrew rose from his seat, his movements slow and deliberate. "We'll see," he said before walking out of the cafe, leaving Margaret alone with her tea and her tears. The drive back to the hotel was somber. Margaret replayed the conversation in her mind, dissecting every word, every gesture. She knew this was only the beginning of a long and painful road, but she clung to the sliver of hope that Andrew hadn't outright rejected her. As she entered the hotel, she was greeted by Claire, who was waiting in the lobby. Her expression was a mixture of curiosity and concern. "How did it go?" Claire asked as Margaret approached. Margaret sighed, her shoulders sagging. "Not well. He's angry and he has every right to be." Claire nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "What's your next move?" Margaret managed a small smile. "Patience. I can't force him to accept me. I just have to show him that I'm here for him, no matter what." Claire's expression softened. "You're braver than I give you credit for, Mom." Margaret chuckled, though the sound was tinged with sadness. "Bravery has nothing to do with it. Love does." That evening, Margaret retreated to her suite, the weight of the day pressing down on her. She sat by the window, staring out at the city lights, and allowed herself to grieve, for the years lost, for the pain Andrew carried, and for the uncertainty of what lay ahead. But beneath the sorrow, there was a flicker of determination. Margaret had faced countless challenges in her life, and she wasn't about to give up now. If she had learned anything, it was that rebuilding something broken required time, effort, and unwavering hope. As the rain continued to fall outside, Margaret whispered a quiet prayer, for Andrew, for Claire, and for the strength to bring her family back together. Margaret stood in the bustling kitchen of the Adams Grand Hotel, observing as chefs prepared dishes for an exclusive dinner event. The hotel was coming alive again, its energy rekindled by recent successes. The fundraiser had been a triumph, bringing attention not only to the hotel but to the community programs it now championed. Yet, as Margaret watched the organized chaos unfold, a familiar unease settled over her. The threats against her hotel and her family weren't over. Later that day, Margaret met with Victor in her office. The investigator spread out a series of documents and photographs across her desk, his expression grim. "They're escalating," Victor said, tapping on a document. "Your former associates are funneling money into a campaign to discredit you. They're reaching out to investors, spreading rumors about your financial stability and leadership." Margaret clenched her fists. "Do we have proof?" Victor nodded. "Enough to trace the money back to their accounts. But exposing them could be risky. They're playing dirty, and if we misstep, it could backfire." Margaret's jaw tightened. "I won't let them win. This hotel is my legacy, and I'll protect it with everything I have." Victor hesitated. "There's more. They've been in contact with someone inside the hotel. Someone feeding them information." Margaret's heart sank. "Who?" "We don't have a name yet, but we're narrowing it down." The thought of betrayal within her own walls made Margaret's stomach churn. She had worked tirelessly to build trust among her staff, and the idea that someone would undermine her efforts was devastating. That evening, Margaret called a private meeting with Claire in her suite. She needed someone she could trust, and despite their rocky history, Claire had proven her loyalty in recent weeks. "I need your help," Margaret began, sitting across from her daughter. Claire tilted her head, her curiosity piqued. "What's going on?" Margaret explained the situation, her voice calm but firm. "Someone in this hotel is working against us. I need you to use your connections and instincts to find out who it is." Claire frowned, her mind already working. "Do you have any leads?" "Victor is looking into it, but I want a second perspective. You know the staff better than anyone. Keep your ears open, and let me know if you notice anything unusual." Claire nodded, her resolve evident. "I'm on it." Margaret placed a hand over hers. "Thank you, Claire. I can't do this without you." Claire's expression softened. "You're not alone, Mom. We'll figure this out." Meanwhile, Andrew's words from their meeting continued to echo in Margaret's mind. She hadn't heard from him since the cafe, but she refused to give up. Every evening she wrote letters to him, pouring her heart onto the page. She never sent them, she wasn't ready for that step, but the act of writing brought her a semblance of peace. One evening as Margaret sat by her window, pen in hand, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and froze. It was Andrew. Taking a deep breath, she answered. Hello? Margaret, Andrew said, his voice cautious. I've been thinking about what you said. About wanting to be part of my present. Margaret's heart raced. And? I'm not ready to forgive you, he said bluntly. But I'm willing to talk. Maybe, figure out what this means for both of us. Tears filled Margaret's eyes, but she kept her voice steady. That's all I could ask for, Jacob. Thank you. It's Andrew, he corrected, though his tone lacked the sharpness it had before. Let's take this slow. Margaret nodded even though he couldn't see her. Slow is fine. I'll follow your lead. As the call ended, Margaret felt a spark of hope. The path to reconciliation was long, but at least they had taken the first step. The following day, Claire approached Margaret with news. I think I found our leak. Margaret's heart leapt. Who? It's Greg Cole, Claire said, her voice filled with both triumph and anger. I overheard him on the phone last night, talking about numbers and ensuring the board's approval. He slipped up when he mentioned a name, Michael Carter. That's one of your former associates, right? Margaret's blood ran cold. Yes, it is. Claire placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder. What do you want to do? Margaret's eyes hardened. We handle this carefully. If we confront him without concrete evidence, he'll deny everything and cover his tracks. I want Victor to confirm it first. Claire nodded, her respect for her mother's resolve evident. We'll get him, Mom. Victor's investigation moved quickly. By the end of the week, he provided Margaret with a detailed report tying Cole to Carter's scheme. Armed with the evidence, Margaret called a meeting with Cole in her office. When he entered, his confidence seemed unshaken, but Margaret saw the flicker of unease in his eyes. Greg, she began, her tone deceptively calm, I want to discuss your recent contributions to this hotel's performance. Cole smirked. Of course. I'm always happy to discuss my work. Margaret slid the folder across the desk. Then perhaps you can explain this. Cole's smirk vanished as he opened the folder, his face paling as he skimmed its contents. This is a misunderstanding, he stammered. Spare me the excuses, Margaret snapped. You've been feeding information to Michael Carter, conspiring to undermine this hotel. Did you think I wouldn't find out? Cole's composure crumbled. Margaret, You're finished, Margaret interrupted. Effective immediately, you're relieved of your duties. Security will escort you off the premises. And if you so much as think about retaliating, know that I have enough evidence to bury you. Cole's shoulders slumped, his bravado extinguished. Without another word, he turned and left the office, his defeat palpable. As the door closed behind him, Margaret exhaled, a mixture of relief and exhaustion flooding her. One threat had been neutralized, but she knew the fight wasn't over. That evening, Margaret joined Claire in the hotel's garden. They sat together in silence, the cool night air wrapping around them. We did it, Claire said quietly. Margaret nodded. One battle down. But the war's not over. Claire looked at her, admiration shining in her eyes. You're incredible, Mom. I don't know how you keep going. Margaret smiled faintly. Because I have to. For this hotel, for our family, for the future. As they sat beneath the stars, Margaret felt a renewed sense of purpose. The challenges ahead were daunting, but she was ready to face them, with her daughter by her side. The Adams Grand Hotel was bathed in golden light, its grand facade glimmering against the dark evening sky. Inside, the grand ballroom buzzed with anticipation. The community gala, a highlight of Margaret's revitalization efforts, was set to showcase the hotel's transformation and its renewed commitment to innovation and inclusivity. Guests included prominent business figures, local leaders, and media representatives, all eager to witness the hotel's new direction. Margaret stood near the entrance, greeting guests with grace and charm. Her black evening gown was simple yet elegant, reflecting her understated confidence. Claire was at her side, poised and radiant, guiding the flow of arrivals. You've outdone yourself, Claire whispered, glancing at her mother. The place looks incredible. Margaret smiled. We did this together, Claire. Don't forget that. As the ballroom filled, the sound of a live jazz band set the tone for the evening. Waiters glided through the crowd with trays of hors d'oeuvres and champagne, and conversations hummed with excitement. The gala was a testament to Margaret's resilience and her determination to protect her legacy. Midway through the evening, Margaret took the stage. The room fell silent as she stepped up to the microphone, her presence commanding attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice warm and steady, "thank you for joining us tonight. This hotel has always been more than just a building. It's a symbol of dreams, hard work, and the power of community. Tonight, we celebrate not just a revitalized hotel but a renewed purpose, to serve as a beacon of hope and opportunity for everyone." Applause erupted, filling the room. Margaret's heart swelled with pride as she stepped back, allowing the evening to continue. For a moment, she let herself believe that everything was finally falling into place. But the night wasn't destined to end smoothly. As the gala reached its peak, Margaret noticed a familiar face in the crowd: Michael Carter. He was flanked by a small group of associates, their presence a stark reminder of the threats still looming over her. Margaret's jaw tightened as she made her way toward him, her posture unyielding. "Michael," she said, her tone neutral but edged with warning. "I wasn't expecting you." Carter turned, his smile thin and calculated. "Margaret." "I couldn't resist seeing the famed Adams Grand in its new glory." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "And here I thought you were more interested in tearing it down?" Carter chuckled, his voice laced with condescension. "Oh, come now. Business is business. Surely you understand that?" Margaret's gaze didn't waver. "What are you doing here, Michael?" He leaned in slightly, his voice low. "Just observing. Enjoying the show. But don't think for a second that I've forgotten about our unfinished business." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Neither have I. And let me assure you, you won't win." Carter's smirk deepened. "We'll see." As he walked away, Margaret's mind raced. She couldn't let him or his associates derail her progress. She needed to act swiftly and decisively. Meanwhile, Claire was circulating among the guests when she overheard a heated conversation near the back of the room. Two of Carter's men were discussing plans in hushed tones, their words dripping with malice. "They're too comfortable," one of them said. "Tonight's the perfect time to make our move. Carter's waiting for the right moment." Claire's stomach churned. She slipped away unnoticed, searching for Margaret. She found her near the stage, her expression a mix of determination and tension. "Mom," Claire said urgently, pulling her aside. "Carter's men are planning something. They're talking about making a move tonight." Margaret's jaw clenched. "What exactly did you hear?" Claire repeated the conversation, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Margaret placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Thank you, Claire. Stay close to the guests. I'll handle this." Margaret scanned the room, her mind racing. She needed to contain the situation without causing a scene. She discreetly signaled to Victor, who was standing near the back. He nodded, understanding her unspoken request, and began moving toward Carter's group. As the evening continued, Margaret and Victor worked in tandem, monitoring Carter and his associates. Tension simmered beneath the surface, but Margaret refused to let it overshadow the night. She moved through the crowd with practiced ease, greeting guests and maintaining an air of control. Then, just as the gala was winding down, Carter made his move. He approached the stage, his voice loud enough to draw attention. "Margaret Adams," he called out, silencing the room. "A woman of vision and tenacity, no doubt. But isn't it curious how quickly visions can crumble?" The crowd murmured, confusion spreading. Margaret stepped forward, her expression calm but steely. "What exactly are you insinuating, Michael?" Carter smirked, holding up a folder. "Just a little light reading. Documents that might interest your investors. I wonder, how much do they know about the cracks in your foundation?" Margaret's stomach tightened, but she didn't falter. "If you have something to say, Michael, say it." Before Carter could respond, Victor appeared at his side, a folder of his own in hand. "And perhaps you'd like to explain these, Mr. Carter," Victor said, his tone cutting. Carter's smirk faltered as Victor opened the folder, revealing evidence of Carter's illegal dealings and sabotage attempts. The room fell into a stunned silence as Victor spoke. "Michael Carter has been funneling funds from his own ventures to undermine this hotel and discredit its leadership. These documents tie him directly to fraudulent activities." Gasps rippled through the crowd as Carter's confidence dissolved. Security appeared, escorting him and his associates from the ballroom. Margaret turned to the guests, her voice steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption. But let this serve as a reminder: integrity and resilience always prevail." The applause was thunderous, a wave of support that reaffirmed Margaret's resolve. Later that night, Margaret stood on the hotel's rooftop, the city lights stretching endlessly before her. Claire joined her, a glass of champagne in hand. "You were incredible," Claire said, her admiration clear. Margaret smiled faintly. "I had to be. For the hotel, for everyone." Claire clinked her glass against Margaret's. For the family too. Margaret nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face whatever came next. The morning after the gala dawned with a renewed sense of optimism. The Adams Grand Hotel buzzed with activity, from staff cleaning up the remnants of the grand event to reporters lining up for interviews about Margaret's stunning victory. The night's revelations had turned the tide in her favor, and the hotel's reputation was stronger than ever. Margaret stood in her office, gazing out at the city. The fight with Michael Carter had tested every ounce of her resolve, but she had emerged victorious. Yet her thoughts weren't on the victory. They were on the unfinished business with her family. Later that afternoon, Margaret met with Andrew in a quiet corner of a nearby park. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers. Andrew's posture was stiff, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket, but he had come, and that was enough for Margaret. "Thank you for meeting me," Margaret said, her voice gentle. Andrew nodded but didn't speak, his gaze fixed on a patch of grass. Margaret took a deep breath, steeling herself. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began. "About trust and forgiveness. I know I can't erase the past, but I want to build something new with you, something real." Andrew glanced at her, his expression conflicted. "You make it sound so easy." "It's not," Margaret admitted. "It's the hardest thing I've ever tried to do. But you're worth it, Jacob. You always have been." Andrew flinched at the name but didn't correct her. "I don't know if I can give you what you want." "I don't want anything from you except a chance," Margaret said, her voice breaking slightly. "A chance to show you that I'm here now and always." They sat in silence for a while, the tension between them slowly easing. Finally, Andrew sighed. "I don't know if I can forgive you, but I'm willing to try." Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she nodded. "That's all I ask." Back at the hotel, Claire was finalizing preparations for a staff appreciation event Margaret had planned. The ballroom was transformed into a lively, colorful space, filled with music, food, and laughter. The event wasn't about luxury but about community, a celebration of the people who kept the hotel running. When Margaret arrived, the staff greeted her with warm smiles and applause. She moved through the room, shaking hands, sharing stories, and listening to their ideas for the hotel's future. Claire joined her, beaming with pride. "You've done something incredible here," Claire said. "They finally see what I've always known, that you're not just a boss. You're a leader." Margaret smiled, her heart full. "I couldn't have done it without you, Claire. You've shown me what it means to truly trust someone." Claire's eyes shimmered with emotion. "I've always trusted you, Mom. Even when it was hard." Margaret pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly. "Thank you for believing in me." The evening ended with a toast. Margaret stood on the small stage in the corner of the ballroom, a glass of champagne in hand. The room fell silent as she began to speak. "This hotel has been through many challenges and so have I," she said. "But what I've learned is that strength comes from the people around you. The Adams Grand is more than just a building. It's a community, a family. And tonight, we celebrate not just what we've overcome but what lies ahead." The crowd erupted into cheers, lifting their glasses in unison. Margaret's heart swelled with gratitude as she looked out at the faces of her staff, her daughter, and even Andrew, who stood quietly at the back of the room. Later that night, Margaret and Andrew sat on the hotel's rooftop, the city spread out before them like a sea of lights. Claire had gone home, leaving the two of them alone to talk. "Do you remember this?" Margaret asked, holding out a photograph of young Jacob playing in a park. "You loved that swing set. You'd laugh so hard I thought you'd fly right off." Andrew stared at the photo, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I don't remember much, but I think I do remember that swing." Margaret's eyes glistened. "I kept every memory I could, Jacob. You were never far from my heart." Andrew nodded, the walls around him slowly crumbling. "Maybe we can make some new memories?" Margaret reached for his hand, her voice trembling. "I'd like that." In the months that followed, the Adams Grand Hotel became a beacon of hope and transformation. The community events grew in popularity, attracting guests from all walks of life. Margaret's leadership inspired not just her staff but the entire city, cementing the hotel's place as a cornerstone of the community. Claire stepped into a larger role, her marketing strategies bringing in a new generation of guests. Andrew began visiting more often, slowly rebuilding his relationship with his mother. And Margaret, for the first time in decades, felt a sense of peace. As she stood in the lobby one evening, watching the bustling activity around her, Margaret smiled. The road had been long and fraught with challenges, but she had built something that would endure, a legacy of resilience, love, and unity. The Adams Grand wasn't just a hotel. It was a testament to the power of perseverance and the strength of family. What do you think about Margaret's journey? Do you feel her efforts to rebuild her family and legacy were worth it? What would you have done in her situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more moving narratives. Your perspective means the world to us, so let us know your thoughts.